The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the clouds as 12-year-old David walked up the steps of Lincoln Elementary School. His backpack was neatly packed with fresh notebooks and sharpened pencils, and his mother had made sure his uniform was perfectly pressed. This was his first day at a new school, and like any kid, he felt those familiar butterflies dancing in his stomach. David's family had just moved to the small town of Meadowbrook after his father received new orders from the military. His dad was currently stationed overseas, serving his country with honor and dedication. His mother, Linda, worked as a nurse at the local hospital and had spent the previous week trying to make their new house feel like home. She had reminded David that morning to be polite, work hard, and remember that first impressions matter. The hallways of Lincoln Elementary buzzed with the excited chatter of students returning from summer break. David found his classroom and took a deep breath before walking through the door. The room was bright and cheerful, with colorful posters covering the walls and desks arranged in neat rows. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Mrs. Patterson had been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for over 20 years. She was known throughout the school as a strict but fair teacher who demanded excellence from her students. At least that's what most people believed. As David entered her classroom, she looked him up and down with the expression that seemed less than welcoming. "You must be the new student," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying a tone that made David feel uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite understand why. "David Johnson, right?" "Yes, ma'am," David replied politely, just as his parents had taught him. "I'm excited to be here." Mrs. Patterson nodded curtly and pointed toward the back corner of the classroom. "You can take that seat over there. The front seats are reserved for my top students." David glanced around the room and noticed that most of the front seats were occupied by students who looked nothing like him. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming that maybe these students had earned those spots through good grades or behavior. He walked to the assigned seat, which was partially hidden behind a tall bookshelf, and sat down quietly. As the other students filed into the classroom, David observed his new classmates. There was Tommy, a freckled boy with red hair who seemed to know everyone. There was Ashley, a girl with blonde pigtails who was already organizing her desk supplies. And there was Jake, who appeared to be the class clown, making jokes that had everyone laughing. When the morning bell rang, Mrs. Patterson called for everyone's attention. She began the day by having each student introduce themselves and share something interesting about their summer. David listened as his classmates talked about family vacations, summer camps, and visits to grandparents. When it was David's turn, he stood up confidently. "Hi, everyone. I'm David Johnson. My family just moved here from California because of my dad's job. Over the summer, I read 12 books and built a model airplane with my dad before he left for his deployment." Several students seemed impressed, and Tommy even said, "That's cool. What kind of airplane?" Before David could answer, Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "That's enough sharing for now. We need to move on to more important matters." She didn't acknowledge David's accomplishments or show any interest in his background. As the day progressed, David began to notice a pattern that made him increasingly uncomfortable. During math class, he raised his hand to answer a question about multiplication. He knew the answer was correct because his father had taught him advanced math concepts during their study sessions together. "The answer is, I'm 44, David said confidently when Mrs. Patterson called on him. Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Are you sure about that?" "Let me check." She made a show of calculating the problem on the board, and when it turned out David was correct, she simply said, "Lucky guess," and moved on without any praise. Later, when Ashley gave the same type of correct answer, Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly and said, "Excellent work, Ashley. You're such a bright student." During reading time, Mrs. Patterson assigned the class to read silently from their textbooks. David finished his assigned pages quickly and raised his hand to ask for additional reading material. Instead of being pleased that he was a fast reader, Mrs. Patterson seemed annoyed. "Just sit quietly until the others finish," she told him. Not everyone needs to show off. David felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He hadn't been trying to show off at all. He simply enjoyed reading and wanted to learn more. This was the same enthusiasm for learning that his parents had always encouraged and praised. At lunch, David sat with some of the other students and tried to make friends. He discovered that Jake loved science just as much as he did, and they started talking about space exploration and rockets. David shared some interesting facts he had learned from his father about military aircraft and satellite technology. Wow, how do you know all that stuff? Jake asked, genuinely impressed. My dad taught me, David explained. He knows a lot about that kind of technology because of his job. When they returned to class after lunch, Mrs. Patterson overheard part of their conversation. Instead of being interested in David's knowledge, she made a comment that stung. Some people like to make up stories to impress others, she said loudly enough for several students to hear. It's better to be honest about what you really know. David felt confused and hurt. He hadn't made up anything. Everything he had shared was true. His father really had taught him about aircraft and technology. They really had built model airplanes together. He really was deployed overseas serving their country. The afternoon brought social studies class where Mrs. Patterson was teaching about American history. She asked the class questions about famous historical figures and important events. David's hand shot up repeatedly because his father had taught him extensively about military history and the role of different groups in building America. But each time David raised his hand, Mrs. Patterson seemed to look right through him. She called on other students instead, even when their hands went up after his. When she did occasionally call on him, she would question his answers more thoroughly than she questioned anyone else's, as if she expected him to be wrong. Are you absolutely certain about that date? She would ask David, even when he gave correct answers. But when other students made actual mistakes, she would gently correct them and encourage them to try again. By the end of his first day, David felt exhausted and confused. He had started the morning feeling excited about learning and making new friends. Now he felt like nothing he did was good enough for his teacher. He couldn't understand why Mrs. Patterson seemed to dislike him when he was trying his best to be a good student. As he packed his backpack to go home, David overheard Mrs. Patterson talking to another teacher in the hallway. These transfer students always think they know everything, she was saying. They come in here acting like they're smarter than everyone else. Someone needs to teach them some humility. David's heart sank as he realized she was talking about him. All he had done was try to participate in class and share his knowledge, just like his parents had taught him. He walked slowly to the school exit, wondering if tomorrow would be any better, and hoping that maybe Mrs. Patterson just needed time to get to know him better. Little did he know that this was only the beginning of a much longer and more difficult journey than he could have ever imagined. 3 weeks had passed since David's first day at Lincoln Elementary, and things had only gotten worse. What he had hoped was just a rough start had turned into a daily nightmare that he dreaded facing each morning. Mrs. Patterson's treatment of David had become so obvious that even some of his classmates were starting to notice. During math class, she would grade David's homework with a red pen, marking problems wrong even when they were correct. When David would politely ask her to check his work again, she would sigh heavily and act like he was wasting her time. I don't make mistakes when grading, she would tell him coldly. Maybe you should double-check your work before turning it in. But David knew his math was right. His father had taught him well, and he had always been good with numbers. At his old school in California, he had been one of the top students in his grade. Here, according to Mrs. Patterson's grade book, he was barely passing. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult Tuesday morning. David had stayed up late the night before working on a book report about a biography of a famous inventor. He had chosen the book because it reminded him of the stories his father told him about innovation and problem-solving in the military. When it was time to present their reports, David watched as his classmates shared their work. Ashley had written about a princess story and received enthusiastic praise from Mrs. Patterson. Tommy had chosen a sports biography and was told his presentation was outstanding. Jake had written about a young detective, and Mrs. Patterson complimented his creativity. Then it was David's turn. He walked to the front of the class, his report neatly typed and carefully researched. He had included interesting facts about how the inventor's creations had helped during wartime, drawing connections to things his father had explained to him about military technology. As David began his presentation, he noticed Mrs. Patterson's expression growing increasingly stern. When he mentioned some technical details about how the inventor's work had been used by the military, she interrupted him. How do you know all of this information? She asked sharply. This seems quite advanced for a 6th grader. David felt his face grow warm. My dad explained some of it to me, and I also did research at the library. Mrs. Patterson crossed her arms. I find it hard to believe that you understood all of this on your own. Did someone help you write this report? The classroom fell silent. David could feel all eyes on him, and he saw some of his classmates exchange confused glances. No, ma'am. I wrote it myself. I think you need to be more honest about getting help with your work, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying across the quiet classroom. Claiming credit for things you didn't do yourself is not acceptable in my classroom. David felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He had worked hard on the report, staying up past his bedtime to make sure every fact was correct. He had been excited to share what he had learned. Now his teacher was essentially calling him a liar in front of all his classmates. But I did write it myself, David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. Take your seat. We'll discuss this after class. David walked back to his desk in the corner, feeling the stares of his classmates. Some looked sorry for him, while others seemed confused about what had just happened. Jake, who had become somewhat of a friend, gave him a sympathetic look. After the other students left for lunch, Mrs. Patterson approached David's desk. She was holding his report, and her expression was stern. David, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I can tell when students are being dishonest about their work. This report is far too advanced for someone your age. David looked up at her, feeling tears threatening to form in his eyes. Mrs. Patterson, I promise I wrote it myself. I can show you my notes from the library. I can explain any part of it. She shook her head dismissively. I'm going to have to give you a 0 on this assignment, and I'm going to call your mother to discuss your dishonesty. That evening, Linda Johnson received the phone call she had been dreading. She had noticed that David seemed unhappy lately, coming home from school quiet and withdrawn. When she asked him about his day, he would just say it was fine and go to his room to do homework. Mrs. Patterson's voice was stern and disapproving as she explained the situation. Mrs. Johnson, I'm concerned about David's behavior in class. He's been turning in work that's clearly beyond his abilities, and when I confront him about it, he becomes defensive. Linda felt her heart rate increase. She knew her son well, and she knew he would never cheat or lie about his schoolwork. Mrs. Patterson, can you give me some specific examples? Well, today he turned in a book report that was obviously written by an adult. He used technical terms and concepts that no 6th grader would understand. When I asked him about it, he claimed he wrote it himself. Linda took a deep breath. Mrs. Patterson, David is a very bright child. His father has taught him a lot about technology and history. It's possible that he really did understand the material. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Johnson, I think you might be overestimating your son's abilities. It would be better for everyone if you helped him focus on age-appropriate work. After the phone call ended, Linda sat David down for a serious conversation. She could see the hurt in his eyes as he explained what had been happening at school. Mom, I promise I'm not lying, David said, his voice shaking slightly. I really did write that report myself. And my math homework is always right, but she marks it wrong anyway. Linda felt a mixture of anger and heartbreak as she listened to her son describe weeks of unfair treatment. She thought about her husband, deployed overseas and serving his country with honor. She thought about the values they had taught their son about working hard, being honest, and treating others with respect. And she realized that David was being punished simply for being who he was. The next day, things got even worse. During science class, the students were working on a project about simple machines. David had learned about pulleys and levers from his father, who had explained how these principles were used in military equipment. When David enthusiastically shared his knowledge with his lab partner, Mrs. Patterson overheard and approached their table. David, I need to speak with you outside, she said curtly. In the hallway, she looked down at him with disapproval. I thought we discussed this yesterday. You need to stop showing off with information that you clearly don't understand. But I do understand it, David protested. My dad taught me about simple machines. I can explain how they work. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. David, your constant need for attention is disrupting my class. If you can't participate appropriately, perhaps you should spend some time in the principal's office to think about your behavior. David felt the unfairness of the situation wash over him like a cold wave. He hadn't been showing off or seeking attention. He had simply been participating in class the way he always had at his old school, the way his parents had taught him to engage with learning. As he sat in the principal's office, waiting to explain himself to yet another adult who probably wouldn't believe him. David began to understand that something was very wrong. This wasn't about his homework or his behavior. This was about something else entirely. Something that made Mrs. Patterson see him differently from the other students. He thought about his father, somewhere far away, serving his country and probably worrying about his family back home. David wondered what his dad would say if he knew what was happening. Would he be disappointed that his son couldn't handle a simple school situation? Or would he understand that sometimes, even when you're doing everything right, the world doesn't treat you fairly? David didn't know the answers to these questions, but he was beginning to realize that his problems at Lincoln Elementary were much bigger than he had first thought. And unfortunately, they were only going to get worse before they got better. 2 months into the school year, David had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. The enthusiastic, curious boy who had walked into Mrs. Patterson's classroom on that first day had been replaced by a quiet, withdrawn child who rarely raised his hand and spoke only when directly asked a question. But even his attempts to remain invisible couldn't protect him from Mrs. Patterson's increasingly hostile behavior. It seemed like no matter what he did, she found fault with it. If he participated in class, she accused him of showing off. If he stayed quiet, she criticized him for not paying attention. It was a game he couldn't win, and he was starting to realize that maybe he was never meant to win it. The morning that changed everything started like any other. David sat in his corner seat, trying to focus on the math problems Mrs. Patterson had written on the board. He had given up trying to show his work or ask questions. Instead, he just did his best to complete assignments and hope for the day to end. Mrs. Patterson was walking around the classroom, checking on students' progress. David noticed that she spent time helping Ashley with a problem she was struggling with, patiently explaining the steps. She encouraged Tommy when he made a mistake, telling him he was on the right track. But when she reached David's desk, her entire demeanor changed. "Let me see your work," she demanded, not asked. David handed over his paper nervously. He had been careful to double-check every answer, knowing that she would find fault with anything that seemed wrong. Mrs. Patterson studied his paper for a long moment, then shook her head. "This is all wrong. You're clearly not understanding the material." David looked at his paper in confusion. He was certain his answers were correct. In fact, he had checked them twice using the method his father had taught him. "Could you show me which ones are wrong?" David asked politely. "I'd like to understand my mistakes." Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed with irritation. "Are you questioning my judgment?" "No, ma'am. I just want to learn from my errors." "Stand up," Mrs. Patterson ordered, her voice loud enough that the entire class stopped working to look. David stood slowly, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. He could sense his classmates staring at him, and he felt heat rising in his cheeks. "Class, I want you all to pay attention," Mrs. Patterson announced, moving to stand in front of the room. "David seems to think he knows better than his teacher. He wants to argue with me about his math work." "I wasn't arguing," David said quietly. "I was just asking—" "Don't interrupt me," Mrs. Patterson snapped. "This is exactly the kind of disrespectful behavior I've been talking to your mother about." The room was completely silent now. David could see the uncomfortable expressions on his classmates' faces. Jake looked like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Ashley was staring at her desk, clearly embarrassed for him. Mrs. Patterson continued her lecture using David as an example of what not to do. "Some students come into this classroom thinking they already know everything. They think they're too smart for the work we're doing here. But let me tell you something about the real world." She paused dramatically, making sure all eyes were on David, who was still standing beside his desk like he was on trial. "In the real world, you need to know your place. You need to understand that not everyone is cut out for the aim things. Some people are meant to be leaders, and some people are meant to be followers. Some people are college material, and some people need to find other paths." David felt like he couldn't breathe. The words hit him like physical blows, each one designed to make him feel smaller and less worthy. Maybe instead of dreaming about things that are beyond your reach, you should focus on more realistic goals. Learn a trade. Find something practical. Stop trying to compete with students who have natural advantages you'll never have. The classroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. David stood there feeling exposed and humiliated in front of all his peers. He wanted to defend himself, to tell Mrs. Patterson that she was wrong about him. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight and he could feel tears threatening to spill over. You can sit down now, Mrs. Patterson said dismissively, as if she hadn't just destroyed a 12-year-old boy's confidence in front of his entire class. David sank into his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to focus on his math paper. The numbers blurred together as he fought back tears. Around him, his classmates had returned to their work, but he could feel their occasional glances. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed confused by what they had just witnessed. During lunch, David sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria. He had lost his appetite, picking at the sandwich his mother had packed for him. Jake approached hesitantly and sat down across from him. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake asked quietly. David shrugged, not trusting his voice. "What she said wasn't fair," Jake continued. "You're one of the smartest kids in our class. Everyone knows that. Does it matter?" David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the teacher. She decides what's true and what isn't." Jake looked frustrated. "But it's not right. My mom always tells me that teachers are supposed to help students learn, not make them feel bad about themselves." David appreciated Jake's friendship, but he didn't see how it could change anything. Mrs. Patterson had made it clear how she saw him, and there didn't seem to be anything he could do about it. The afternoon brought social studies class, where they were studying different types of government and leadership. Mrs. Patterson was explaining the concept of authority and why it was important to respect those in charge. Leaders earn their positions through hard work, education, and natural ability, she explained to the class. It's important to recognize when someone has earned the right to lead and when someone should step back and let others take charge. As she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to David, making it clear that her lesson was directed at him personally. The message was obvious: know your place and don't aspire to things beyond your station. That afternoon, as students were packing up to go home, Mrs. Patterson called David to her desk. She was holding a photograph that had fallen out of his backpack when he was organizing his supplies. "What's this?" she asked, holding up the picture. David's heart skipped. The photograph showed him standing next to his father, who was wearing his military dress uniform complete with ribbons and insignia. It had been taken during a ceremony before his father's deployment, and David treasured it because it was one of the last photos they had taken together. "It's a picture of me and my dad," David said simply. Mrs. Patterson studied the photograph with a skeptical expression. "This man is wearing a military uniform." "Yes, ma'am. My dad is in the Army." She looked at David, then back at the photo, then back at David again. Her expression suggested she didn't believe what she was seeing. "David, it's not appropriate to bring fake photos to school. This kind of pretending has to stop." David felt like he had been slapped. "It's not fake. That's really my father." Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "I'm going to hold on to this until I can speak with your mother. We need to have a serious conversation about honesty and appropriate behavior." As David walked home that day, he felt completely defeated. Mrs. Patterson had taken the one thing that connected him to his father while he was deployed overseas. She had called his family a lie, questioned his honesty, and made it clear that she didn't believe he was worthy of respect or fair treatment. That evening, when his mother came home from her shift at the hospital, she found David sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his homework but not really working on it. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Linda asked, noticing something was wrong. David looked up at his mother, and for the first time since starting at Lincoln Elementary, he couldn't hold back the tears that had been building up for weeks. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "I need to tell you what's really been happening at school." And finally, after months of trying to handle the situation on his own, David told his mother the whole truth about Mrs. Patterson's treatment. He told her about the unfair grades, the public humiliation, and the constant message that he wasn't good enough. Most importantly, he told her about the photograph and what Mrs. Patterson had said about his father. As Linda listened to her son's story, she felt a mixture of heartbreak and fury building inside her. Her husband was serving his country with honor overseas, and his son was being treated like this? Not on her watch. It was time to take action. Linda Johnson didn't sleep much that night. After hearing David's full account of what had been happening at school, she spent hours pacing around their living room, her mind racing with anger and disbelief. Her son had been suffering in silence for months, trying to handle an impossible situation on his own. The next morning, Linda called in sick to work. She had more important things to do than her usual shift at the hospital. She spent the early hours gathering documents, making phone calls, and preparing for what she knew would be a difficult but necessary confrontation. First, she called the school and requested an immediate meeting with Mrs. Patterson and Principal Williams. When the secretary asked what the meeting was regarding, Linda simply said it was an urgent family matter that required immediate attention. Then she made a more difficult call. Using the special communication line available to military families, she contacted her husband at his base overseas. General Robert Johnson was in the middle of preparing for an important briefing when he received the urgent family message. "Linda, is everything okay? Is David hurt?" His voice crackled through the long-distance connection, concern evident even through the static. "Robert, I need to tell you what's been happening to our son at school." Linda's voice was steady, but her husband could hear the controlled anger underneath. As she explained the months of mistreatment, the unfair grading, the public humiliation, and finally the incident with the photograph, General Johnson's silence grew heavier. She said, "What about our family?" he asked, his military training keeping his voice level despite the fury building inside him. She accused David of bringing a fake photo to school. She said he was pretending, and that it was inappropriate. "Robert, she took the picture of you two and refused to give it back." General Johnson had faced enemy fire, had made life-and-death decisions under pressure, and had commanded thousands of soldiers in some of the world's most dangerous places. But hearing that his son was being treated this way while he was serving his country overseas filled him with a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Linda, I want you to go to that school today. I want you to bring every document we have, service records, commendations, photographs, everything. And I want you to set up a video call so I can participate in this meeting." At 10 o'clock that morning, Linda walked into Lincoln Elementary School carrying a folder thick with official documents. She was wearing her nurse's uniform, having come directly from calling in her replacement at the hospital. Her expression was calm, but anyone who looked closely could see the determination in her eyes. Principal Williams was a kind man in his early 60s who had been running Lincoln Elementary for over a decade. He greeted Linda warmly, though he seemed puzzled by the urgency of the meeting request. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming in. I understand you wanted to discuss David's progress." "Yes, I do. But I think it would be best if Mrs. Patterson joined us for this conversation." When Mrs. Patterson entered the principal's office, she looked confident and slightly annoyed at having her morning routine interrupted. She had dealt with upset parents before, and she assumed this would be another case of a mother making excuses for her child's poor performance. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm glad you could come in. I've been meaning to call you again about David's ongoing issues with honesty and appropriate classroom behavior." Linda opened her folder and placed several documents on Principal Williams's desk. "Before we discuss David's behavior, I think there are some things about our family that you should know." The first document she placed on the desk was Robert Johnson's official military service record. Principal Williams picked it up and began reading, his eyebrows rising higher with each line. "Mrs. Patterson, are you familiar with the rank of general in the United States Army?" Linda asked calmly. Mrs. Patterson glanced at the document dismissively. "Mrs. Johnson, I don't understand what this has to do with David's classroom behavior." Linda placed another document on the desk. This one showed her husband's recent promotion to general, along with a list of his commendations and awards. Then another document showing his current command position at Fort Braxton, where he oversaw training operations for thousands of soldiers. Principal Williams was now staring at the documents with wide eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, your husband is General Robert Johnson? The General Johnson who was featured in Military Times magazine last month?" "Yes, he is. And this is the photograph that Mrs. Patterson confiscated from David yesterday, claiming it was fake." Linda placed the family photo on the desk. In it, David stood proudly next to his father, who was wearing his dress uniform with all his medals and insignia clearly visible. It was obviously a real photograph, taken at an official military ceremony. Mrs. Patterson's face was beginning to turn pale as the reality of the situation sank in. She picked up the photograph with shaking hands, studying it more closely than she had the day before. I thought," she stammered but couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "You thought what exactly?" Linda's voice was still calm. but there was steel underneath it. You thought my 12-year-old son was lying about his father? You thought he was pretending to have knowledge about military technology? You thought he was making up stories to impress his classmates? Principal Williams was reviewing the documents with growing alarm. Mrs. Johnson, I had no idea about your husband's position, if there have been any issues with David's treatment. Linda reached into her folder and pulled out a thick notebook. This is a journal that David has been keeping since his second week of school. He wrote down every incident, every unfair grade, every public humiliation, and every inappropriate comment made by Mrs. Patterson. She opened the notebook and began reading entries in David's careful handwriting. September 15th. Mrs. Patterson marked my math homework wrong even though Jake had the same answers and got them all right. September 22nd. During science class, Mrs. Patterson said I was showing off when I answered a question about simple machines. October 8th. Mrs. Patterson made me stand in front of the class and told everyone I needed to learn my place. With each entry, Mrs. Patterson seemed to shrink further into her chair. Principal Williams' expression grew more serious as he realized the scope of what had been happening in his school. Linda continued reading. October 20th. Mrs. Patterson said some people are meant to be followers, and that I should focus on learning a trade instead of thinking about college. I never said. Mrs. Patterson began to protest. Are you calling my son a liar? Linda's voice cut through the air like a blade. Because that's exactly what you've been doing for months. At that moment, the computer in Principal Williams's office chimed with an incoming video call. Linda had arranged for her husband to join the meeting from his base overseas. Principal Williams, I'd like you to meet my husband. The screen filled with the image of General Robert Johnson, sitting in his office at Fort Braxton. Behind him, military flags and commendations were visible on the walls. He was wearing his service uniform with all his ribbons and medals clearly displayed. The sight was impressive and unmistakable. Principal Williams, Mrs. Patterson. General Johnson's voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to commanding respect. I understand there have been some questions about my family's honesty. Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. The man on the screen was clearly the same person from the photograph she had confiscated, and his rank and position were beyond question. General Johnson continued, I'm currently commanding officer at Fort Braxton, overseeing training operations for the 82nd Airborne Division. I've served 3 tours overseas and have been in the military for over 20 years. My son David is my pride and joy, and I've taught him everything he knows about military technology, history, and values. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. I understand that Mrs. Patterson has been questioning David's honesty, his intelligence, and even the legitimacy of our family. I find this deeply troubling, especially since I'm currently deployed and unable to advocate for my son in person. Principal Williams found his voice. General Johnson, I want to assure you that we take these allegations very seriously. If there have been any inappropriate actions taken by our staff. Principal Williams, General Johnson interrupted gently. My son has been keeping detailed records of his treatment at your school. My wife has brought documentation proving everything David has told us. The question now is, what are you going to do about it? Mrs. Patterson finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake. I didn't realize. I thought. You thought what? General Johnson's voice remained calm, but his eyes were steely. You thought my 12-year-old son was lying about his father's military service? You thought he was pretending to be smart? You thought he deserved to be humiliated in front of his classmates? The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the computer. Mrs. Patterson couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Principal Williams was reviewing David's journal with growing horror at what had been happening in his school. Finally, General Johnson spoke again. I've dedicated my life to serving this country and protecting the rights and freedoms of every American, including the right of every child to receive a fair education. I never imagined that while I was overseas defending these principles, my own son would be denied those very rights in his own classroom. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Patterson realized that her months of prejudiced behavior had not only hurt an innocent child but had also insulted a decorated military officer who was serving his country with honor. The meeting was far from over, but the truth was finally out, and now there would have to be consequences. The silence in Principal Williams' office stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Mrs. Patterson sat frozen in her chair, staring at her hands while the weight of her actions settled over her like a heavy blanket. On the computer screen, General Johnson waited patiently, his presence commanding respect even through a video call from thousands of miles away. Principal Williams was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Mrs. Patterson. "Margaret, I think you need to explain to General and Mrs. Johnson exactly what happened here." Mrs. Patterson's voice was shaky when she finally spoke. I made assumptions, wrong assumptions. I looked at David and I thought he was trying to be something he wasn't." She paused, struggling with the words. "I've been teaching for so long and I thought I could tell which students had potential and which ones didn't." "Based on what?" Linda asked quietly, though everyone in the room knew the answer. Mrs. Patterson couldn't say the words out loud, but her silence spoke volumes. She had judged David not on his abilities, his character, or his potential, but on his appearance. She had decided before she even knew him that he wasn't worthy of the same opportunities and respect she gave to other students. General Johnson's voice came through the computer speakers, still calm but filled with disappointment. "Mrs. Patterson, I've spent my entire career working alongside people of every background, every color, every religion. In the military, we judge people by their actions, their courage, and their commitment to their fellow soldiers. Nothing else matters when you're depending on someone to have your back." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. "Some of the finest officers I've ever served with, some of the bravest soldiers who have saved lives and defended our country, are people who might have been overlooked or dismissed by someone who judged them the way you judged my son." Mrs. Patterson was crying now, quiet tears rolling down her cheeks as she finally understood the full impact of what she had done. She hadn't just been unfair to one student. She had been perpetuating a system that judged children by their appearance rather than their potential. Principal Williams took charge of the situation. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to need you to gather all of David's graded assignments from the past 3 months. We'll need to review every grade and every assessment to ensure they were fair and accurate." Over the next several hours, the truth became even more clear. When David's work was reviewed properly, it became obvious that he was actually one of the brightest students in the class. His math homework was consistently correct. His essays were well written and thoughtful, and his science projects showed genuine understanding of complex concepts. Mrs. Patterson had been systematically marking his work incorrectly, giving him lower grades than he deserved, and dismissing his contributions to class discussions. When the grades were corrected to reflect his actual performance, David went from being a barely passing student to being at the top of his class. The school district was notified immediately. Superintendent Dr. Martinez arrived at the school that afternoon to personally handle the situation. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with General Johnson via video call, she made the decision to immediately suspend Mrs. Patterson pending a full investigation. "This is not just about one student or one teacher," Dr. Martinez explained to the Johnson family. "This is about ensuring that every child in our district receives fair and equal treatment. What happened to David should never happen to any student." The investigation that followed revealed that David's case was not isolated. Several other students, particularly students of color, had similar experiences in Mrs. Patterson's classroom over the years. Parents came forward with their own stories of unfair treatment, biased grading, and inappropriate comments. Mrs. Patterson was ultimately terminated from her position and lost her teaching license. The school district implemented new policies for monitoring classroom practices and established an anonymous reporting system for students and parents to report unfair treatment. But perhaps the most important change came in the conversation that the situation sparked throughout the community. Parents, teachers, and students began talking openly about bias, fairness, and the importance of giving every child the opportunity to succeed. David, meanwhile, was transferred to Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom, where he flourished under the care of a teacher who recognized his potential and encouraged his love of learning. His grades improved dramatically, not because he started working harder, but because he was finally being evaluated fairly. Jake and several other classmates from Mrs. Patterson's room also spoke up about what they had witnessed, showing courage that many adults had failed to display. Their voices helped confirm David's account and demonstrated that even young people could recognize injustice when they saw it. 3 months later, when General Johnson returned from his deployment, he visited Lincoln Elementary School. He spoke to an assembly of students, teachers, and parents about service, courage, and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. Heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, he told the assembled crowd. Some of them wear uniforms and some of them carry backpacks. Some of them lead soldiers and some of them are just trying to get through 6th grade. But what makes someone a hero isn't how they look or where they come from. It's how they treat others and whether they stand up for what's right. David sat in the front row, beaming with pride as he listened to his father speak. Next to him sat Jake, Ashley, and several other classmates who had become true friends once they were free from Mrs. Patterson's toxic classroom environment. After the assembly, General Johnson met privately with Principal Williams and Dr. Martinez to discuss the changes that had been implemented since the incident. We've established new protocols for teacher evaluation and student feedback, Dr. Martinez explained. We're also providing ongoing training for all our staff about unconscious bias and fair classroom practices. General Johnson nodded approvingly. The most important lesson my son learned this year wasn't from any textbook. He learned that sometimes the world isn't fair, but that doesn't mean you should give up fighting for justice. He also learned that there are good people who will stand up for what's right when they know the truth. As for Mrs. Patterson, she eventually reached out to the Johnson family through a letter. In it, she took full responsibility for her actions and expressed genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. She had begun working with a counselor to examine her own biases and was volunteering at a community center, trying to make amends for her past behavior. Linda and Robert Johnson chose to respond to her letter with grace, accepting her apology while making it clear that her actions had consequences that couldn't be easily undone. They hoped that she would use her experience to become a better person and to speak out against the kind of treatment she had subjected their son to. David kept the letter, not out of anger, but as a reminder of the importance of standing up for yourself and others. He had learned that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to continue, and that speaking truth to power, while difficult, is sometimes the only way to create change. Years later, David would go on to attend West Point, following in his father's footsteps of military service. But he would also become an advocate for educational equality, working to ensure that other children never had to experience what he went through in Mrs. Patterson's classroom. The story of what happened at Lincoln Elementary became a powerful reminder that assumptions based on appearance can blind us to the potential that exists in every child. It showed that courage comes in many forms, from a 12-year-old boy who kept detailed records of injustice to parents who fought for their child's rights to a community that chose to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and fairness. Most importantly, it demonstrated that while prejudice and discrimination still exist, they don't have to win. When good people stand together and demand better, change is possible. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons come not from textbooks, but from the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. David never forgot Mrs. Patterson's words about knowing his place, but he learned that his place wasn't defined by her limitations or her biases. His place was wherever his talents, hard work, and character could take him. And in America, that could be anywhere at all.